Prologue. The accident. Eric Steele had always been a person whose opinions were sought after. A brilliant careerist, he represented the face of progress in the police department. A smile, a signature suit, a perfect haircut. But behind the facade lurked demons: alcohol, arrogance, and a sense of impunity. His successes couldn't fill the inner emptiness left by his divorce. To fill this gap, he immersed himself in nights of alcohol and self-satisfaction. On that fateful evening, he was spending time at the Siren's bar. Eric was telling stories from the past to his colleagues, raising another glass. No one dared to ask what condition he was in, and his own confidence allowed him to ignore the obvious risks. When he left the bar, his steps were unsteady, but he got into the car with an expression of absolute certainty. The black sedan, shining under the streetlights, became an instrument of destruction. At that moment, Jackson Hayes was finishing his shift as an ambulance driver. He was thinking about heading home to his wife and children. It seemed that just a little more, and he could rest. But fate had other plans. A flash of headlights, the deafening crash of a collision, a car flipping several times, and then terrifying silence. While Steele slowly crawled out of his damaged car, struggling to comprehend what had happened, Jackson lay lifeless beneath the wreckage of the ambulance. The police arrived quickly. Their actions were decisive and purposeful. Surround Steele, protect him from unnecessary questions, shield him from the eyes of witnesses. "We'll sort it out later," one of them said, patting him on the shoulder like an old friend. Part 1. The Innocent Man. Ray Johnson had known from a young age what it meant to fight for a place under the sun. Born into a poor family in one of the city's most troubled neighborhoods, he learned independence early. From childhood, he helped his mother, took on odd jobs wherever he could, unloading goods at the market, repairing old bicycles, bringing home every penny he could. His mother, Ida Johnson, was a strong-willed woman, but her hard work in her youth had taken its toll, and now she suffered from chronic illnesses requiring constant care and expensive medications. As Ray grew older, he found his passion working with machines. He became a mechanic at a small workshop, where, thanks to his skills, he quickly became one of the best. His dream of opening his own auto repair shop was a source of inspiration, despite all the hardships. He often said that one day he would escape poverty, that he would make his mother's life better. As Ray grew older, he found his passion working with machines. He became a mechanic at a small workshop, where, thanks to his skills, he quickly became one of the best. His dream of opening his own auto repair shop was a source of inspiration, despite all the hardships. He often said that one day he would escape poverty, that he would make his mother's life better. But his past, which included minor offenses, a fight in his youth, a few petty thefts to help his family, became shadows, constantly haunting him. After the accident in which Jackson Hayes died, the police investigation was swift and superficial. Pressure from above demanded immediate results to calm public outrage. In search of an easy suspect, the police quickly turned their attention to Ray Johnson. His past mistakes, though long atoned for, became an anchor that dragged him down. The police were looking for someone to blame, not for the truth. The evening Ray was arrested, he had just returned home after a long workday. Tired and hungry, he was preparing dinner for his mother when there was a knock on the door. The police entered without warning, not giving him a chance to explain himself. Their voices were filled with certainty bordering on contempt, and their eyes were cold with calculation. "You're under arrest for your involvement in a fatal traffic accident," one of them said coldly, twisting his arms behind his back. His mother, frightened and confused, tried to intervene, but her cries went unheard. The following days became a true nightmare for Ray. The interrogations were harsh and exhausting. The investigators used threats, manipulation, and even physical pressure. In a locked room, without a lawyer or support, he spent countless hours listening to accusations that felt like a verdict. They pressured him over his past, over his mother's health, over everything he couldn't give her. Confess, and it will all end sooner, they repeated again and again. Fear for his mother, who was left alone, and his physical exhaustion broke him. In the end, with trembling hands, he signed the document they required, without even reading it. This moment became a turning point in his life. The trial that followed was a farce. The judge, known for his biased rulings, barely hid his attitude towards the case. The prosecution presented minimal evidence that barely stood up to criticism, but it was enough to create the image of a guilty party. Ray's lawyer, provided by the state, did everything he could, but the system was stacked against them. Attempts to point out inconsistencies in the case and draw attention to the lack of direct evidence were met with a wall of indifference. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom filled with bitterness and pain. Ray's mother, weakened by worry, collapsed in the courtroom, her faint scream lost in the noise. Ray, standing before the judge, unable to hold back his tears, whispered, "I'm not guilty," his words drowned in the indifference of those who decided his fate. He was sentenced to years in prison for a crime he did not commit, while the real culprits remained free. Part 2. A son's grief. For Marcus Hayes, his father was not just a relative, he was a true hero and role model. Jackson, the ambulance driver, had dedicated his life to saving others. His kindness and willingness to help inspired Marcus from an early age. They often sat together in the evenings, discussing the future, dreams, and plans. Jackson always told his son that the most important thing was to be honest and help others, even if it meant making sacrifices. Marcus tried to live up to his father's expectations, learning to be strong and generous like him. But life sometimes delivers the harshest blows. His father's death became an event that turned Marcus's world upside down. He felt lost, as though the ground had slipped from beneath him. The funeral was held in a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, where grief mixed with a sense of injustice. In the eyes of his mother, younger sister, and even his father's friends, there was the same silent pain. Looking at his father's photo, Marcus felt a deep emptiness. He asked questions to which there were no answers. Why did this happen? Why did a man who dedicated his life to helping others become a victim of someone else's negligence? In moments of despair, Marcus decided that he would not let this tragedy remain just a sad episode in a series of events. He wanted to do something meaningful to honor his father's memory and tell the truth. His YouTube channel, which had previously featured carefree videos about sports and travel, now became his voice. The first video he made was filled with emotion. He talked about the kind of person his father was, the terrible accident, and the injustice his family was going through. Marcus's words were sincere, and they touched many hearts. People watching the video wrote supportive comments, shared it with friends, and expressed their condolences. The video quickly gained thousands of views, reaching beyond his circle of friends and acquaintances. But Marcus did not stop there. Realizing the power of his words, he decided to use the platform to seek justice. He began to delve into the details of the accident, speaking with people who might know something important. This turned out to be a difficult and exhausting process. Often, he was refused help, but sometimes he met people who shared his pain and were willing to tell their story. Gradually, his channel became a place where people who had experienced similar tragedies gathered. They shared their stories, supported each other, and sought solutions to common problems. With each passing day, Marcus's channel grew in popularity. People, strangers to each other, were uniting around the idea of fighting for the truth. Marcus became a kind of leader for this small but growing community. His videos became more informative, and he invited experts, lawyers, and psychologists to join. He sought out evidence, questioned witnesses, and tried to figure out why his father's case had been pushed into the shadows while the guilty remained free. This work helped him cope with his own grief, but more importantly, it gave him the strength to move forward and help others. Part 3. The Journalist. Lisa Hartman was a woman who had always been at the forefront of the fight for justice. Her reputation as an investigative journalist was not only a result of her ability to gather information, but also of her genuine desire to change the world, at least within the scope of her articles. Her investigative work often exposed the darkest corners of society, corruption at the highest levels, crimes covered up by those in power, and injustices so deeply embedded in the system that they were accepted as normal. For Lisa, fighting for the truth was not just a profession, but the meaning of her life. In her personal life, the fight for truth was also an essential part of her story. Her family had once faced an injustice that left an indelible mark on her destiny. When her father, an influential lawyer, found himself caught in lies and manipulations, Lisa felt firsthand what it meant when the system worked not for those who were right, but for those who could manipulate it. This experience led her to fight resolutely against any form of injustice, and not to stop until she got an answer. The story of Marcus Hayes and the tragedy of his family became personal for Lisa. She could not remain indifferent, especially after reading one of Marcus's videos, where he openly stated that his father had been a victim of the system. His words were filled with pain and anger, but more than that, determination to seek justice despite all obstacles. For Lisa, this story became something more than just another investigation. It was personal because she saw in it her own fight, her chance to help someone, as she had once been helped in her own case. Her first step was a thorough review of all the case materials. Lisa began to gather information about the accident, reviewing reports, making inquiries to the police, and keeping track of new facts that could shed light on unclear moments. It was important not only to figure out the facts, but also to understand why the case had not received the proper attention. She studied all published records from the scene of the accident, photos and interviews with witnesses to piece together the full picture. To deepen her investigation, Lisa reached out to her contacts within government and police circles, as well as to people who might have additional information not included in official reports. Some of these people were willing to provide information, others were not. But her reputation and persistence paid off. Lisa met several times with the police officers involved in the investigation, and although she couldn't reveal all her cards, she felt that something was being hidden from the public. Lisa gained access to secret documents related to the accident investigation. One such document was a forensic report that did not align with the publicly available information. This discovery became a turning point. The document indicated serious discrepancies in the witness testimony and the investigation's handling of the case. Additionally, it contained information suggesting that the braking system of the car Eric Steele was driving might have been damaged, which could point to negligence or even intentional manipulation of evidence. This discovery provided a new basis for reopening the investigation. Occasionally, Lisa held private conversations with Marcus, not only to collect facts, but also to understand his emotional state. Marcus was filled with determination despite his grief and the constant threats that accompanied his efforts. Lisa could see the weight on his shoulders, and she could feel how his ideas were evolving, from seeking justice for his family to wanting to change the system as a whole. When Lisa published her article, she knew the consequences could be unpredictable. She was not only uncovering a crime, but exposing a network of lies and corruption that surrounded the case. The article was published on the front page of one of the country's largest publications and quickly gained national attention. Lisa was unafraid of backlash because she knew that truth and the people were behind her, and that was her greatest weapon. Within hours of the article's release, a storm began. Tens of thousands of people started discussing the article on social media, sharing it, and calling for an investigation. At first glance, everything seemed to be against her. The authorities, as usual, tried to distance themselves from the scandal, announcing that the investigation would continue, but that no new steps would be taken. However, this time, public opinion did not fall silent. Lisa's article resonated with thousands of people whose lives had been affected by corruption, injustice, and inaction from the law enforcement agencies. Soon posters demanding the truth appeared on city streets, and hashtags like #JusticeForJackson and #FreeRay became trending topics on social media. People started organizing protests and marches, calling for real transparency in the investigation. Once Lisa's article had spread across the country, attention to Marcus's case and his family grew exponentially. She soon began receiving calls from independent lawyers who wanted to assist with the appeal of Ray's case. They offered their services for free, ready to support a new phase of investigation and defend his rights. Activists and human rights defenders also appeared, willing to highlight the issue on the international stage. People started sending letters to the police and prosecutors, demanding a review of cases involving blatant injustice. As each day passed, the situation became more tense. Lisa and Marcus faced threats and pressure from those who wanted to bury the case. Lisa received anonymous calls, which she ignored. She knew her actions could have serious consequences, but by then, it was too late to stop. She felt that this story had become part of her life, part of her own struggle for truth. Marcus, for his part, realized that now he was not alone. Lisa and her article gave him not only new strength, but also hope that justice would be restored. When the protests turned into massive demonstrations, Part 4. The rise of public outrage. The injustice surrounding the deaths of Ray and Jackson, and the subsequent failure of the authorities to hold anyone accountable, was a bitter reality that had long festered beneath the surface of society. But the publication of Lisa Hartman's article sparked a fury that could no longer be contained. The dam had broken, and now there was a flood of voices demanding change. At first, it was small murmurs of few frustrated people online, a handful of protests in major cities. But soon as the article gained traction, the calls for justice grew louder, fiercer, and more urgent. What began as a ripple in the fabric of society turned into a wave, one that swept through impoverished neighborhoods, places where the sting of injustice had long been felt. The protests, often spontaneous, often fueled by a profound sense of collective rage, surged in intensity as more and more people felt emboldened to join in. In the streets of cities like Atlanta, New York, and Los Angeles, crowds gathered, chanting slogans, holding signs that read "Justice for Ray," "Stop the cover-up," and "End impunity now." The streets were filled with anger, yes, but also with hope. The people were not just fighting for the memory of Ray and Jackson, but for the many others who had fallen victim to a corrupt system that had never cared about their lives. But it wasn't just in the streets where this fury was making an impact. Social media became the battleground where the fight for justice was waged. Hashtags like #JusticeForJackson and #FreeRay became the rallying cries of a movement. Every post, every tweet, every shared video was a battle in a war for transparency, for accountability, for the right to be heard. The story of Ray and Jackson and the failures of the system that had led to their deaths went viral. People shared the article Lisa had written, discussed the details of the case, and uncovered new pieces of evidence that pointed to the systematic nature of the corruption that had allowed these deaths to happen in the first place. The hashtags spread like wildfire. From coast to coast, from urban centers to small towns, the outrage was palpable. Celebrities, influencers, and everyday citizens alike joined the conversation, pushing the issue to the forefront of national discourse. The media, now forced to cover the growing story, were quick to jump on the bandwagon. News outlets from around the world reported on the ongoing protests, the public's demands for justice, and the mounting pressure on the authorities to act. The calls for accountability became impossible to ignore. People wanted more than just empty promises. They wanted change. They wanted to see the system, the police, the courts, all of it held to the same standard that they demanded for everyone else. No longer were the powerful, the influential, and the rich able to hide behind their wealth and status. This was no longer just about two families. It was about a society that had had enough. They were done waiting for justice to come to them. They were demanding it. The threats and the continued fight. Lisa and Marcus had become symbols of that fight. But with the rising tide of public outrage came a new wave of threats, both subtle and overt. For Lisa, the anonymous calls started almost immediately after the publication of her article. They were never anything specific, just vague, threatening words whispered into the receiver. "You're playing with fire," one voice hissed. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it," another warned. But Lisa wasn't afraid. She had spent years exposing the truth, risking her life, and sacrificing her safety for what she believed in. If anything, these threats only hardened her resolve. Marcus, too, found himself at the center of the storm. He had always been a man of few words, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But now, with the protests growing louder and the public demanding answers, he was thrust into the public eye. He was constantly bombarded by reporters, photographers, and activists eager to speak with him. Some were sympathetic to his cause, while others were only interested in using him for their own agendas. Through it all, he remained focused on the bigger picture, finding justice for Ray and Jackson. The threats against both Lisa and Marcus escalated as the protests reached their peak. Anonymous messages appeared on social media calling for their silence. Rumors spread that someone was going to take care of them, that their efforts would be met with violence if they didn't stop. But for Lisa, these threats were nothing compared to what she had already faced in her career. She had dealt with far worse in her years as an investigative journalist. And Marcus, he had already lost too much to be afraid now. The people needed him, and he wouldn't back down. As the protests grew, so did the pressure on the authorities. In Washington, D.C., politicians were forced to address the situation. Under intense public scrutiny, the authorities finally agreed to revisit Ray's case. What had once been dismissed as a tragic accident was now being re-examined under the lens of public outcry, with new evidence emerging that forced their hand. The renewed investigation was met with cautious optimism by the public, though many remained skeptical. Had the authorities really had a change of heart, or were they simply trying to save face in the wake of a growing movement? Lisa and Marcus knew that they couldn't wait for the system to fix itself. They had to push. They had to keep the pressure on. Lisa, with her insider knowledge and access to key documents, continued to dig deeper, uncovering more damning evidence that suggested foul play. She discovered that there were more witnesses who had been silenced, more pieces of the puzzle that had been conveniently ignored by the initial investigation. Meanwhile, Marcus, now a symbol of the fight for justice, found his own voice. He gave impassioned speeches at rallies, calling on the people to continue their fight. "This isn't just about my father," he would say, his voice breaking with emotion. "This is about all of us. It's about the lives of our loved ones, our friends, our communities. It's about a system that has failed us all. And we won't stop until we make them listen." The protests reached a boiling point when a major demonstration was held in front of the police headquarters. Thousands of people gathered, chanting, holding signs, and demanding that the authorities act. For the first time, the police were forced to confront the full extent of their negligence. Cameras captured the growing tension, and the world watched as the authorities, backed into a corner by the sheer size and intensity of the protests, promised to launch a full investigation into the deaths of Ray and Jackson. But for many in the streets, this promise was only the beginning. The real battle was just getting started. The people knew that they couldn't trust the system to fix itself. They had to be vigilant, they had to keep demanding accountability, and they had to make sure that their story was never forgotten. A new wave of evidence. The protests, the media attention, and the growing demand for justice finally bore fruit. The authorities, pressured from all sides, agreed to bring in outside experts to re-examine the evidence. New witnesses came forward, some of them offering testimonies that contradicted the original investigation. There were rumors of a cover-up, whispers of officers who had been complicit in the events surrounding Ray and Jackson's deaths. Lisa's tireless work had uncovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond what anyone had initially believed. In a dramatic turn of events, one of the key officers involved in the case was found to have falsified critical evidence. The revelation sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. Suddenly, it wasn't just the deaths of two individuals at the center of the controversy. It was a far-reaching scandal that implicated a whole network of people in power. Lisa was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. She worked tirelessly, meeting with attorneys, activists, and even insiders who had once been too afraid to speak out. Every conversation, every new piece of evidence, brought the case one step closer to breaking wide open. Marcus, too, found new strength as he saw the tide of public opinion shifting in their favor. The support of the people, combined with the new evidence, was beginning to turn the tide in their favor. The authorities had no choice but to take action. The moment of reckoning. The moment of reckoning. When the investigation finally reached its conclusion, the verdict was nothing short of explosive. Several key figures in law enforcement were arrested, charged with corruption, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. The case against Ray's killers was finally brought to court, and after months of legal battles, justice was served. The families of Ray and Jackson were awarded a settlement, and a public apology was issued. The protests, the social media campaigns, and the tireless work of Lisa and Marcus had succeeded in forcing the authorities to act. But the true victory was not just in the legal outcome. It was in the message that had been sent. The people had demanded justice, and they had received it. The fight for justice, however, was far from over. The system was still deeply flawed, and there were many more cases that needed to be addressed. But the victory of Ray and Jackson had sparked a movement, one that could no longer be ignored. Part 5. Restoring Justice. The aftermath of the public outrage was nothing short of transformative. The intense wave of protests, the media frenzy, and the tireless work of Lisa, Marcus, and their allies had created a new momentum. It was a momentum that couldn't be stopped, a force that had irrevocably shifted the very foundation of the justice system. What had started as a battle for one man's freedom, for one family's fight against a broken system, had become a battle for the soul of an entire nation. For Lisa Hartman, the long hours of researching, documenting, and uncovering the truth were about to pay off in a way she hadn't quite anticipated. When the case against Ray was reopened and the evidence she had uncovered began to be reviewed, it became clear that the system of corruption that had allowed Ray's wrongful imprisonment was far more extensive than anyone had initially thought. The dismantling of the corruption. The review of Ray's case, which had initially seemed like a mere formality, turned into a full-fledged investigation into the flawed practices of the police department, the court system, and the very fabric of law enforcement. The witnesses that Lisa had found former officers who were now willing to speak out, and even civilians who had been ignored or silenced painted a damning picture of systematic corruption, deliberate obstruction of justice, and malicious misconduct. What had initially seemed like a tragic mistake was now being revealed as part of a larger scheme of cover-ups and miscarriages of justice. Eric Steele, the officer who had played a pivotal role in framing Ray and covering up the evidence, found himself at the heart of the investigation. His once impeccable reputation, built on decades of law enforcement service, crumbled as the weight of the evidence mounted against him. Steele had been one of the most decorated officers in the department, a man known for his uncompromising approach to law and order. But the more investigators dug into his past, the clearer it became that his aggressive pursuit of justice had often meant bending the law, or, more often than not, completely disregarding it. The testimonies given by Lisa, Marcus, and other key participants in the case revealed a terrifying pattern of abuse and corruption. Lisa's journalistic skills had always been sharp, but in this case, they were something more. She had brought together a network of whistleblowers, insiders, and legal experts, all of whom were eager to expose the rot within the system. The fact that so many of them had remained silent for so long became a tragic commentary on the pervasive culture of fear that had allowed these injustices to continue. But with the public's support, with the pressure of the protests, and with Lisa's relentless drive to seek the truth, the walls of secrecy began to crumble. Eric Steele, now facing a growing wave of accusations and the undeniable evidence of his wrongdoing, was forced to confront the reality of his actions. He could no longer hide behind the badge. He had to face the consequences of his abuse of power. When the internal investigations reached their conclusion, Steele was formally charged with a range of crimes, including manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and falsification of evidence. The police department, which had once shielded him, now found itself having to answer for the very officer who had been its star. But Steele's fall from grace was just the beginning of the broader reckoning. As the investigation into his actions continued, more and more corrupt officers were exposed. Some had been involved in the framing of Ray, while others had been complicit in covering up other cases of abuse and misconduct. The sheer number of officers implicated in the scandal was staggering. For many, it was the clearest sign yet that the rot had spread too far, that the trust between law enforcement and the public had been irreparably damaged. The judge who had presided over Ray's original trial, the one who had failed to see the glaring errors in the case, was also forced to step down in disgrace. His resignation sent a clear message to the public. There would be no more tolerance for those who allowed such injustices to happen. The people had demanded justice. And now they were getting it. The historic release. But for Marcus, Lisa, and all those who had been fighting for Ray's freedom, the true victory came when Ray was finally released from prison. The moment his name was cleared, when the authorities officially acknowledged the failure of the justice system, it was a historic one. It was a moment that reverberated through the hearts and minds of everyone who had been part of the fight, and indeed, through the very fabric of society. The day of Ray's release was filled with raw emotion. Marcus stood outside the prison gates, his heart pounding in his chest. For so long, it had seemed like this moment would never come. For years, he had carried the weight of his father's wrongful imprisonment. He had fought tirelessly for justice, even when the system seemed to conspire against them. But now, as he stood there, watching the gates open and his father emerge, he realized that all the pain, the struggle, the sacrifices had not been in vain. Ray, his once imposing frame now frail from years of imprisonment, stepped out into the light. For a moment, he stood still, taking in the world that had moved on without him. And then, as though overcome by the sheer weight of the moment, he collapsed into Marcus's arms. His son held him tightly, and for the first time in years, Ray felt the embrace of freedom. "I knew you'd come for me," Ray whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "I knew you'd make them listen." And there, in that moment, as Marcus held his father in his arms, they both realized that their fight had changed the world. It wasn't just about Ray's freedom anymore. It wasn't even just about justice for Jackson and the countless others who had suffered. It was about something much larger. Hay had shown the world that the system could be held accountable. They had proven that even the most entrenched power structures could be challenged. And they had given the people hope that change was possible, even in the darkest of times. Ray's release became a symbol of the power of collective action. It was a victory not just for one man, but for a whole movement. The protests, the media coverage, the public's relentless demand for justice, it had all led to this moment. The system had been forced to bend to the will of the people, and it was a moment that would go down in history. The beginning of reform. As Ray walked into a new life, one that he had been denied for so many years, the ripple effects of his release continued to unfold. The public's outrage, which had begun as a whisper, had now grown into a roar that could not be ignored. The protests that had swept the nation had not just forced the authorities to reconsider Ray's case, they had forced them to reconsider the entire system. The police department, once a symbol of unchecked power, was now in disarray. Corrupt officers were fired, their careers ruined by the very truth they had tried so hard to suppress. The judges who had been complicit in the wrongful convictions were removed from their positions, and a wave of reforms began to sweep through the justice system. Public trust in law enforcement, which had been shattered by years of abuses, was slowly beginning to be restored. New policies were implemented to ensure greater accountability within the police force. A new oversight body was established to investigate claims of misconduct, and new training programs were put in place to ensure that. It was only the beginning. The road to reform would be long, and there was still much work to be done. But for the first time in years, there was hope. There was the possibility of change. And it was clear that the fight for justice, for accountability, and for a better future was just beginning. The victory of Ray's release and the subsequent reforms that followed served as a powerful reminder. Justice may be delayed, but it is not impossible. Change may take time, but it is within reach, as long as there are people willing to fight for it. Epilogue. Legacy. The Jackson Hayes Foundation had become more than just an institution. It was a beacon of hope, a sanctuary for those whose voices had been silenced by the injustices of a broken system. The foundation was born from the same fire that had fueled Marcus and Ray's fight for justice, a fire that had once been lit by the wrongful conviction of Ray, and which had since spread into a full-blown movement aimed at restoring justice to those who had been abandoned by the system. It was a symbol of not just one man's fight for freedom, but the collective struggle of countless families and individuals who had found themselves caught in the gears of an unforgiving legal system. Marcus, who had once been a young man fighting for his father's release, now stood as the director of the foundation, a leader of a movement that had become a lifeline for many. The foundation's work was vast and varied. It offered legal assistance to those wrongfully accused, providing a team of expert lawyers who are not only capable, but deeply passionate about righting the wrongs of the justice system. It also worked to raise awareness about the systemic issues within law enforcement, providing resources for education and training on criminal justice reform. Ray, on the other hand, had found a new calling. After his release, he struggled, as many did, with finding his place in a world that had changed dramatically during his years in prison. But in time, he rediscovered a sense of purpose, a sense of mission. Ray had become a public speaker, traveling around the country to speak to communities about the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how impossible the odds may seem. His speeches were filled with raw emotion, wisdom born from the pain he had endured, and a message of resilience. He spoke not just of his own fight for justice, but of the broader need for unity, accountability, and compassion in society. Ray's newfound purpose also extended to his work with the Foundation. He became an active advocate for prison reform, using his own experiences to highlight the flaws in the system and the deep psychological toll that wrongful convictions had on those affected. His voice carried weight, not just because of his past, but because he was a living testament to the power of redemption and the human capacity for change. The Jackson Hayes Foundation had a unique power. It united people from all walks of life, people who had once felt powerless and alone, now brought together by a shared belief in justice. Families who had been torn apart by the system found solidarity in the Foundation's outreach programs. It wasn't just about providing legal aid. It was about restoring dignity to those who had been robbed of it. Marcus and Ray's leadership, rooted in their own trauma and triumph, resonated with people from all corners of the country. They were not just representatives of a cause. They were living examples of how one family's pain had the potential to heal and transform the lives of others. The ripple effect. As the years passed, the impact of their work was felt far beyond the Foundation's offices. Marcus continued his career as a journalist, writing passionately about the flaws in the criminal justice system and the importance of reform. His articles were published in major newspapers, and his investigative pieces led to a broader public discourse about the need for reform in policing, sentencing, and incarceration. His work was a powerful reminder that the fight for justice was ongoing, that the victories won were never final, but rather part of a larger battle for equality and human dignity. Marcus's reporting often took him back to the communities he had once fought for, the poor neighborhoods that had become battlegrounds for both systemic inequality and violent crime. He would return to those places, visiting the families of people still caught in the web of wrongful convictions, offering his help, sharing his story, and sometimes even sitting down with the children and spouses of those incarcerated. He understood now more than ever that the work of a journalist was not just to inform, but to inspire action. And his articles, written with a deep empathy and fierce resolve, continued to spark change. The Jackson Hayes Foundation became a touchstone for many other organizations across the country, offering advice and support to those trying to create similar programs in their own communities. What Marcus and Ray had started in the wake of their personal tragedy became a movement, one that challenged the narrative of how justice should function. It was a movement that advocated for change from the ground up, from the people who had lived the struggles, not just from policymakers in their ivory towers. It was a movement that had power because it was rooted in truth, in the stories of real people, people like Marcus and Ray, who had witnessed the failures of the system firsthand. Ray's influence grew too, as he was invited to speak at conferences and to testify before legislative committees about the experiences of people who had been wrongfully incarcerated. His story was powerful because it was not just a personal narrative. It was the story of thousands of people who had been denied justice and left to rot in prison. His words inspired those in positions of power to reconsider their approach to criminal justice. Over time, his activism began to influence real change at the local and state levels. In many ways, the Jackson Hayes Foundation was not just a foundation for victims of injustice. It became a rallying cry for a larger societal movement. The fight for justice was not one confined to any single courtroom or courtroom battle. It was a battle that was being fought in schools, communities, and courtrooms across the country. And the fight was fueled by the stories of real people whose lives had been shattered by the failures of the system, just as Ray's had been. The legacy of Jackson Hayes. Though Jackson Hayes was no longer alive to witness the incredible changes that had taken place, his memory lived on in the foundation, in the people who carried his name forward, and in the hearts of those who had been inspired by his story. Jackson had been the catalyst for everything that followed, the person whose tragic fate had sparked a chain reaction of events that led to tangible change. His death, while devastating, had been the spark that ignited a fire of justice that would never die. The Jackson Hayes Foundation became a living memorial to his legacy. It was a reminder that even in the face of great adversity, even in the face of unspeakable loss, there could be triumph. Jackson's story, a story of struggle, injustice, and untold pain, was now a story of hope, redemption, and collective action. His memory was etched into every corner of the work being done, from the legal battles fought by the foundation to the personal stories shared by those who had found solace in the work that had grown out of the ashes of tragedy. Marcus, now an older man, often found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He would sit with Ray, watching the young activists who were now carrying the torch forward. He saw in them the same determination that had driven him when he was younger, the same fire that had pushed him to fight for his father's freedom. It was a humbling thing to witness the next generation taking up the mantle, ready to continue the work of those who had come before them. But even as the foundation continued to thrive, and the movement grew stronger, Marcus and Ray knew that the fight was far from over. There would always be new battles to face, new families to help, and new injustices to confront. But they also knew that they had laid the groundwork for lasting change. They had created a legacy that would not only outlast them, but would continue to grow and evolve. And so, with each passing day, they continued their work, fueled by the same passion and commitment that had begun their journey all those years ago. For Marcus, Ray, and the countless others who had been touched by their struggle, the fight for justice had become a lifelong mission, a mission that would never end. But it was a mission that had meaning, for it was a mission that was rooted in love, in hope, and in the unshakable belief that, no matter how long the road, justice would always prevail. In the end, the legacy of Jackson Hayes was not just the story of a man wronged. It was the story of a movement born out of one man's wrongful conviction, but destined to reshape an entire nation. It was a legacy of truth, of sacrifice, and above all, of justice. And it was a legacy that would live on for generations to come. It wasn't just about providing legal aid. It was about restoring dignity to those who had been robbed. Posters demanding the truth appeared on city streets, and hashtags like #JusticeForJackson and #FreeRay. They were not just representatives of a cause. They were living examples of how one family's pain had the potential to heal and transform the lives of others.